This video was intended to inform and educate the public.
The thin blue line, loyalty versus justice. Welcome back to the Junkyard News. Today, we're diving into a topic that has been making headlines and sparking debates. Why would police officers turn against one of their own to protect the department as well as law enforcement as a whole? Well, let's start with the basics. We all know that police officers, like anybody else, can form tight-knit groups, like a little internal community. I, for one, usually refer to it as the Blue Line Brotherhood. They rely on each other for protection and backup in dangerous situations, and they're supposed to share a common goal with protecting the community as a whole. But what we find sometimes is that in times of trouble, they're more interested in protecting themselves. But what happens when the actions of one or a few threaten to tarnish the reputation of the department or law enforcement in general? We have seen several cases, several videos, and a lot of news where police officers have been accused of misconduct while on duty, sometimes even off duty, excessive force, corruption, theft, deprivation of rights under color of law, you name it. In these situations, the department can be in a dilemma. Do they stand with their officer, or do they prioritize justice? For them, it seems it's a very difficult decision to make. On one hand, there's loyalty to your colleagues, someone you've served with, someone you've trusted, someone you hope would have your back in a dangerous situation, someone you've trusted with your life. But on the other hand, there's a duty to uphold the law and maintain the public's trust, what little is left. So why would police officers choose to protect their department as a whole instead of an individual officer? Conversation regarding that amongst colleagues in law enforcement may go something like, "I heard about what happened to him. Should we say something?" And another officer might reply, "Are you crazy? You want to be labeled a snitch? We keep our mouth shut and just let internal affairs handle it and stay out of it. It's none of our concern." Another factor is the culture within law enforcement. In departments, there's what's referred to as the code of silence, an unwritten rule that discourages officers from reporting misconduct of their colleagues. And the culture within police departments plays a significant role in how officers respond to misconduct allegations. The prevailing attitude in most cases is to protect the department as a whole at all costs. And with that being the case, most officers would feel pressure to remain silent and just stay out of it, even if they see a travesty of justice occurring or about to occur. But here's the thing. Prioritizing the department and law enforcement as a whole over justice ultimately erodes public trust even further than it has eroded already. When communities and the public in general see officers circling the wagons, closing ranks to protect one of their own, it reinforces the perception of a broken system, further widening the gap between law enforcement and the community that they supposedly are there to protect and serve. In the end, the decision to turn against a fellow officer, even one that has actually done nothing wrong, to protect the department as a whole is a complex one, influenced by factors such as loyalty, fear, and organizational culture. But if law enforcement truly wants to rebuild trust with their community, they must be willing to hold their own accountable. Case in point, we're going to talk about a situation where a judge just awarded a huge amount of money to a former law enforcement officer who got to feel what the public feels every day in this country when they come across an officer or officers who think that they're above the law and can get away with anything.
St. Louis judge is awarding $23.5 million to a former St. Louis police officer who was beaten by colleagues while working undercover. Luther Hall was badly injured in the 2017 attack during one of several protests that followed the acquittal of Jason Stockley, who is a former St. Louis police officer.
A judge just the other day awarded $23.5 million to an undercover St. Louis officer beaten by colleagues while he was just doing his job. Now, the officer that was heavy-handed, mostly during this interaction, was a white officer, and the victim, another cop, who happened to be an undercover at the time, and was heading back to the department, you guessed it, was a man of a darker complexion named Detective Hall. Luther Hall was badly injured back in 2017. He was attacked by his fellow Blue Line brothers and sisters for merely walking back to the station after he had patrolled the streets during protests following the acquittal of Officer Jason Stockley. Stockley was a former St. Louis officer on a murder charge that stemmed from the shooting death of a black man. So he was in plain clothes, amongst protesters, keeping an eye for unlawful activity during these First Amendment protests. But when he was finished and started walking back to the station, he came across a couple officers, one of which was Officer Randy Hayes. Now, ultimately, Randy Hayes was sentenced to go to federal prison for his role in the attacks on Luther Hall. He was sentenced to more than 4 years in prison for his role in the beating. Now, Officer Hayes, who was 34 at the time, pled guilty in 2019 to a felony count of deprivation of rights under color of law. He was ultimately sentenced by a judge to 52 months in prison and 2 years of probation. Now, prosecutors wanted 70 months, while the defense was asking for 36 months, but he had faced up to 10 years in prison. 3 other officers were charged also in this interaction. Now, former St. Louis police officer Randy Hayes at one point was quoted as saying, during or directly after the beating, "Going rogue really feels good." Another officer was part of the interaction with, at the time, Detective Luther Hall, was Officer Bailey Coletta. Now, Bailey Coletta was sentenced to 3 years of probation and 2 consecutive weekends of imprisonment. The 28-year-old pled guilty back in 2019 to making false statements to a federal grand jury about her knowledge of the arrest and assault of a fellow St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department officer who was working undercover and whom police mistakenly believed was a protester.
Can't stop, won't stop lying. It's like we're just denying the reality, saying it's gonna be alright.
And that tells you something right there. Black man walking down a sidewalk by himself when protests were going on in other areas of the city, and somebody wanted to get some. They had no idea he was a Blue Line brother. At the time, Officer Dustin Boone, 37 of St. Louis, Missouri, appeared before the United States District Court Judge E. Richards Weber. Boone was sentenced to 12 months and 1 day in prison for aiding and abetting the deprivation of civil rights under color law. Officer, at the time, Christopher Myers, admitted to damaging a cell phone of Detective Hall. The 30-year-old pled guilty to deprivation of rights under color of law, essentially depriving Hall's right to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. It is claimed that he took Hall's phone and smashed it. Oh, a cell phone. What's he going to do with that? Grab and smash. Had no idea this was a Blue Line brother you guys were attacking, did you? Well, you do now. So in St. Louis, Monday, A St. Louis judge awarded nearly $23.5 million to a former police officer, Detective Hall, who was beaten by colleagues while working undercover during protests. Hall was badly injured back in 2017, attacked during one of several protests that followed the acquittal of Jason Stockley, who again was a former St. Louis officer who was on a murder charge that stemmed from a shooting death of a black man. Hall previously settled separate lawsuits with the city for $5 million back in 2022 when he sued 3 former colleagues, Randy Hayes, Dustin Boone, and Christopher Myers, for their roles in the attack. Now Hayes, who got the most serious punishment and probably dished out the most punishment, never responded to the lawsuit, despite being served while he was in prison on civil rights violation. A judge had issued a default judgment in favor of Hall back in February and heard testimony Monday about why Hall should receive damages. Hall's claims against Boone's and Myers are still pending. Now, former Detective Hall, in court on Monday, talked about the severe physical and emotional damages that followed the beating. He suffered several herniated discs and a jaw injury that left him unable to eat. He says he developed gallstones with complications requiring surgeries. Mr. Hall had to endure this severe beating, and while that was happening, he knew it was being administered by his Blue Line colleagues. In addition to this settlement with Hall, the city of St. Louis last year paid nearly $5.2 million over allegations that police violated the rights of dozens of people. This has been deemed an unlawful assembly. You must disperse. But when they try to leave, they can't, because they're being squeezed smaller from all sides. So even if you said, okay, we'll leave, there's nowhere to go. They've got you surrounded, they got all the exits blocked, and they keep bringing you into a smaller circle. That's what they were doing to these protesters. Even the ones that wanted to leave, once it was declared an unlawful assembly. But they couldn't. They were trapped. They were not allowed to leave. At the same time, police were saying, please leave. What do you think about a police department and law enforcement in general who choose to further erode the public trust and choose the Blue Line community over the community and public that they are supposed to protect and serve? Let me know in the comments. And thanks again for watching the Junkyard News. Who knows, one of these days we may hear about you in the next video. Thanks again.
One of these days these boots are gonna walk all over you.